Hi everyone, welcome to week 5. Welcome to the lecture video where we're talking about careers within policing and a little bit of criminal justice. So I know that because we are an intro to policing, the focus is going to be the careers within policing, but some of those careers are also within the system as a whole, and so we're going to talk a little bit about those. So I wanted to make sure that, it wasn't just, oh, well, he talked about these as well. That there is others, but we'll get to it as we get into it. So, first and foremost, I want to just say, so this is going to be substantially less full than some of the previous last 2 weeks. Not that there's not content to talk about, but this is an easier content to talk about rather than getting into nitty gritty of investigations and things like that. So, as far as law enforcement goes, what we need to understand is there are 3 different levels of law enforcement here within the United States. We have the federal level, we have the state level, and we have the local level. Okay, so this is important. This may be an exam question at some point. What are the 3 different levels of law enforcement? There's federal, state, and local. So there is federal law enforcement agencies, and we're going to talk about those first. We're going to talk about these in these order. So there are federal law enforcement agencies. These are things that run at the national level. These are things that are found all throughout the United States. They usually have headquarters in very specific areas, but they might have regional offices. These are federal jobs, so even though you might be still, working in PA, you live in PA, you work in PA, but it could be a federal job. Then there's state law enforcement, which is obviously the state level. So that means, if you're born in PA, you work in PA, and you're working for the Pennsylvania state law enforcement agencies, you're going to be all around the state of Pennsylvania. And then there's the local level. And the local level is kind of a misnomer. And in case you don't know, a misnomer means that the name is not quite accurate to what it is. So local is exactly what it sounds like. There's local municipalities. So here in Erie County, we have the Erie Police Department for Erie City, but when you start getting into the different parts of the county that are part of Erie County, like Mill Creek, they have their own police department. Fairview, Lawrence Park, they have their own police department. So those are local law enforcement agencies. But there's also so many more than just local. Or rather, I guess the better thing to say is that local covers every local. So by numbers alone, the federal law enforcement agencies are the smallest number. The state law enforcement, usually every state has one, so there's about one per. There might be a couple, but it's usually one per. And then local is for every single municipality. So local law enforcement is the largest group within these 3. Okay. So, as I said, we're going to talk about federal first. So, federal law enforcement tends to be the 3-letter systems, or the 3-letter organizations, and as well as some other ones. But we're going to talk about these because some people tend to think that it's not a criminal justice career. It is a criminal justice career. There is a belief that you have to get an intelligence degree. Intelligence is one of the possible degree paths that these types of units look for, and that's not completely true. Criminal justice is one, intelligence is one, English is one, surprisingly, social work is one. They look for people that can understand the system. So, federal law enforcement is, like I said, at the highest level. These are across the board. They provide services for the entirety of the United States, and so their reach is far beyond just one area. So these are law enforcement agencies that have to be able to move and able to be present in any state at any given time. And so some of the big ones that we're going to talk about and that you should probably know is the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That's the big famous one that most people know about. We're going to talk a little bit about the FBI. The ATF, which is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Administration. The U.S. Marshals Service. The Secret Service. And then we're going to talk about, I'm going to jump down to the bottom, the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. Yes, that is a government job. Yes, that's a federal government job. TSA is a federal government job. And we'll talk about why when we get to TSA. But I also want to talk about, I have the USCIS and ICE down here. ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and USCIS is the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service. And I have an asterisk next to those two. We're going to talk about those two together, okay? And you'll understand why when we get into it. But let's first talk about the FBI. So just a little bit of history about the FBI, because it's important to note, because there are some key names and dates that people tend to know or they really want to know, and so it's important to at least talk about it. So in 1908, our Attorney General at the time in the United States, Charles Bonaparte, formed the FBI, and this was a result of, at the time, there was not a FBI, there was not a group of people and individuals designed to investigate things for the federal government. Well, not for the federal government, for the Attorney General. And on behalf of President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, with his approval, Charles Bonaparte originally borrowed some investigators from like Secret Service and things of that nature, but eventually they had to be returned. And so with his blessing, Bonaparte developed a precursor of the FBI. It was just the Bureau of Investigation. It wasn't the FBI. It wasn't Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was just the Bureau of Investigation at the time. And so he formed this Bureau of Investigation and actually hired a couple of the Secret Service investigators that they had borrowed. He essentially recruited them full-time, and also some additional people as well. And so 1908 is when the FBI first really came to be. But the big one that most people are familiar with, whether because they are obsessed with the FBI or because they love spy programs and things like that, because it's always mentioned in every spy documentary, spy show, whatever. 1924, we see J. Edgar Hoover named the acting director of the Bureau. And for those of you who aren't familiar, J. Edgar Hoover was the primary person behind what is the development of what we now understand as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because of J. Edgar Hoover, it went more from just investigating potential crimes to intelligence gathering and full-on file keeping. And this is, by the way, before World War II and the post-World War II record keeping that several countries had as well. But Hoover made a big deal about the processes and way that the FBI had to operate, as well as agents and how they operate in the field and how many are currently active and all these other things. So like Hoover is the person that people point to for being the big influence on the FBI for being what they are today. So it's important to note that he wasn't the first person. He was not the one who founded the FBI. A lot of people say he's the one that started the FBI. No, he's the one that really got it going into what we understand the FBI is today. But it really was started in 1908 by Charles Bonaparte. And then the other key date that I just want you to know, and it's more for you as a U.S. citizen rather than for FBI But in 1966, President Johnson signed the Freedom of Information Act. And if, in case you don't know, the Freedom of Information Act says that you have the right to know your personal information. So I just wanted to let you know about that. So technically, you can request if you have a file at the FBI. It might be redacted. There might be some things that you don't get, but essentially, if there's information on you, you have the right to know about your personal information. 1966, we still are dealing with this problem. All right. And I don't mean within the FBI, I mean in general with information of that we have and who owns it. AKA, look at the internet. Sorry, I'm a little, I'm feeling a little under the weather as I'm recording this, so apologies for the coughing and whatnot. Anyway, the FBI. So their main roles, and I want to emphasize main roles, plural. As you can see, there's several points here, and I just want to emphasize this all comes from the actual FBI's website. I pulled all this information directly from the FBI.gov page, like their official webpage. So these are the things that the FBI currently does and has been doing most of them for quite a long time. As you can tell, some of the newer ones are towards the top. But so obviously, one of the big things that they do now is they investigate terrorism. Ever since our post 9/11 world, the United States has doubled down and re-emphasized a focus on terrorism and trying to prevent terrorism. They're the people behind the Big Brother is watching kind of thing. The whole we have the right to tap your phones if we believe that you may be a terrorist kind of thing. So their whole big thing currently, one of their big ones is investigating terrorism. But the other one that they're really big on, and it's important, and it's because this is such a federal problem. It's not something that's just local. This happens everywhere. It even happens internationally. But cybercrime, cybercrime is, for a lack of any better word, is a new crime. It's not a new crime, like we've known about it for a while, and unfortunately, which ages a lot of people, including myself. Cybercrime as a term is only like 20 years old, which makes me feel really old because that means I'm older than it. But cybercrime itself is any kind of crime that uses technology to complete the criminal activity. And cybercrime itself is now very connected to internet crime, and because of the anonymity and the widespreadness that the internet provides, cybercrime is a very, I'm just not going to sugarcoat it. It's a big beast. It's a problem. Cybercrime is a huge problem with policing right now at both the local levels, the state levels, and the federal levels. Like this is a big issue. Cybercrime is not something that's easily finished, not something that's easily tracked, and things of that nature. And so the FBI has dedicated a decent amount of time and effort working into cybercrime, investigating procedures, developing new techniques and software that helps them prevent cybercrime or continue to track cybercrime no matter where it goes. But the FBI acts as kind of like the main office for any kind of cybercrime. They tend to work with the FBI for that. So obviously they also, because they investigate terrorism, they're also, one of their duties is exposing, preventing, and investigating counterintelligence. That's selling and distributing state secrets, things that are vital to the United States and its security, that kind of stuff. But they also work on civil rights enforcement, which, if you know the history of the FBI, is kind of a weird one to say because they may or may not have been involved with some civil rights problems themselves. But currently at the national level, they are the national patrolling, policing unit that deals with civil rights enforcement, things of that nature, as well as public corruption. They investigate public corruption, so politicians, money laundering, things like that. They also investigate weapons of mass destruction, that's WMDs. They eliminate transnational organized crime groups. They're looking for big organized crime. Things that are going not just in one area, but multiple areas and going around. So not a little podunk, Erie biker gang. We're looking for mafia type stuff. They also combat violent crimes involving gangs, crime against children, missing persons, and this again from their direct website. Combat violent crime in, quote, Indian country. Obviously, this is not the correct terminology anymore. This would be First Nation lands or First Nation people's land, things like that. So when they say Indian country, they mean Native American reservations and things of that nature. So because they have their own unique jurisdiction in land based off of when the government gave them the land, the federal government tends to step in for those. And the FBI also investigates white-collar crime. And if you're not sure what white-collar is, white-collar crime is the fancy big stuff. It's the cryptocurrency scams. It's the pyramid schemes and Ponzi scams. And white-collar crime is embezzlement and falsifying tax documents, all those things that you'd get sent to white-collar prison or rich people prison where you are essentially at a hotel resort. Yeah, that's white-collar crime. It's the things that aren't typically violent. They're not the dangerous, murderous things. They're the he stole millions of dollars type of thing. Excuse me. So the ATF is our next one. So the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is the ATF. And so obviously, I'm going to say this right now. Since they are the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, yes, their main purposes are regulation of firearms and regulate alcohol and tobacco, specifically preventing illegal use and trafficking. Like, that's pretty obvious, right? The ATF is all about alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. That's fair. That's a fair statement. However, it's important to note that the ATF also looks into explosions and arson. They investigate incidents where arson and bombings are a potential problem. They also deal with the illegal use and storage of explosives. This includes fireworks. You may not think of fireworks as explosives, but they are explosives. So the ATF is actually the ones in charge of explosives and fireworks and things like that. So if there's the illegal use and storage of fireworks, ATF gets involved. It's just one of those weird things that you don't tend to think about. But the ATF does deal with explosives and firearms. They also work on counterterrorism. So I know the FBI, their big thing has been terrorism. But like I said, since 9/11, it's not just the FBI, but a lot of different departments at all different levels have been tasked with combating some type of terrorism and counterterrorism into their job duties. So a modern day ATF also deals with counterterrorism. Their job is to intercept and prevent terrorist activities, especially those that are involving firearms, explosives, and arson. So does this mean that if there was a potential terrorist bombing, that the ATF would be the only one involved and the FBI would not? No, they probably both would be involved and collaborate with each other. That's another thing that, because of Hollywood, that people tend to not believe, but these individual bureaus and groups and things like that, a whole big component of actual modern policing and realistic policing at any level is collaboration. You got to collaborate with the other groups because you're sharing information. Your goal is to stop the bad guy. Your goal is to solve the crime. Your goal is to figure it out. And if that means you have to work with another group, then you work with another group. Okay? So the other thing is the ATF looks specifically also at combating violent crime. Their focus is primarily on criminal organizations. So much like how the FBI focused on transnational organized crime, which Transnational means it's across the borders of the United, well, not across the borders, but it's within the confines of the United States. It's in multiple areas. They focus on the local level criminal organizations. And I don't mean local like, oh, it's the Little Erie area. No, they would be looking still at the larger ones, but they'd look at, well, what is the organization, criminal organizations in Pennsylvania? And they might have a list of that kind of stuff. So please notice the ATF is alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. There's a different group for drug enforcement, the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration. So while alcohol and tobacco is sometimes grouped with drugs, the drug enforcement is focused on illegal as well as controlled substances. So we're talking both the prescription medicines and pills, as well as the illegal drugs like heroin, methamphetamines, things like that. So the DEA, their primary focus, I can't believe I have to say it, they're the drug enforcement. They need to enforce controlled substance laws. They need to regulate drugs. And this means determining what drugs are legal to use, as well as what drugs are illegal, what they do to people, why they're illegal, what kind of sentencing, things like that. So one of the things that the DEA does is they target drug trafficking organizations. So they identify and take action against organizations and individuals involved in the growing, the manufacturing, or distribution of illegal drugs. Again, illegal drugs. So one of their focuses as far as an enforcement group, as far as a policing group, is to make sure that the laws for drug regulation is being followed and that they are taking action against any organization or individuals who are involved in the illegal growing, the illegal manufacturing, or the illegal distribution of drugs. And part of this is all with this idea of reducing the availability of illicit drugs. You work with non-enforcement programs at home, here in the United States and abroad, internationally, to decrease the supply and demand for illegal substances. The DEA's focus is to reduce the requirement and the possibility of illegal drugs. And so a big part of the DEA, I said this about the other ones because it's true, but the DEA is a especially unique one, that collaboration is a big deal. Because within the U.S., they work with the individual justice systems. They work with both the federal level and the local jurisdictions, the local state courthouses, local police departments, things of that nature, to help make sure that drug enforcement is being properly followed. But they also work internationally. The DEA works with many different international governments and not necessarily crime agencies, but like drug agencies and bureaus that other countries have, because not every country approaches it the same way. But they work to combat global drug trafficking problems. Their goal is to work with other countries to ensure that the drug trade is slowing down to a stop, is their ideal goal. So, I've said this in another class before, and I'm going to give you a hint. It's going to be on a quiz again. So the U.S. Marshals is the oldest still operating multifaceted federal law enforcement agency. Hear me as I say this. The U.S. Marshals is the oldest still operating federal law enforcement agency in the United States. The U.S. Marshals. They were established in 1789, okay? And the U.S. Marshals themselves are essentially and this is as generic as I can be, they are the federal police force. Okay? U.S. Marshals act almost like the federal police. They're just they're not just an enforcement agency, but they're an enforcement agency that their duty is across the United States. So they have a unique structure. compared to all the other ones. So like I said, a lot of these have like one main base of operations, typically in Washington, D.C. The U.S. Marshals is different. U.S. Marshals have 94 districts, and these are all related to the federal judicial districts. So we, as hopefully U.S. citizens, all know that the United States, there's 50 states as one United States, so there's 50 individual regions. We also know that there are the Midwest, the Southwest, the Northeast. Like, we have geographic regions, but we also have federal judicial districts. This is where part of your vote is for your particular district. This has to do with population. This is representation. This is what kind of judges deal with what things. Pennsylvania has 3 districts. Because we're a wide state, we're separated into 3 different districts. So not every state has more than 1 district, and not every state has more than 2 districts. But because of the way the United States is, it's such a large body of land, they've broken up the areas into judicial districts. And there is a U.S. Marshal's office. There's one for every district. There are 94 districts, so there are 94 U.S. Marshal offices. This is how they operate. They have different sets of marshals in every area for the different districts, for the different things. So it's not like, oh, you have one U.S. Marshal from New York State who's going all the way to California to get a prisoner. No, that's not what that means. But they have marshals in every judicial district. So that's something that makes them very unique, other than being the oldest still in operation one. So what do the U.S. Marshals actually do? Well, like I said, they are the police. They are the enforcement arm of the federal courts. So if there is a federal court order, they're the sheriff. They're the police officer who ensures that that particular outcome is fulfilled. They act as deputy marshals and investigators. So they do look into federal crime. Like, they're not just there to make sure that a judicial decision or a court case works out well. They also investigate crimes, usually ones that cross state lines. They apprehend federal fugitives. They are the ones that are in charge of the witness security program, the witness relocation program, as we sometimes talk about it. That's the U.S. Marshals. They also are in charge of the protection of the federal judiciary. So when we say federal judiciary, we're talking judges, jurors, state witnesses, whatever that might be. The U.S. Marshals are in charge of the protection for anyone involved in a federal court case. They also do federal prisoner transportation. They're the big ones for prisoner transportation for federal prisons. They enforce orders related to civil disturbances and terrorism. So the FBI will probably work with the local U.S. Marshals to enforce any kind of terrorism claim against an individual. That's why I said there's a lot of inner working between departments. The other thing is they also are the ones that seize property obtained through illegal activities in federal cases. So, like, if something happens, it's the marshals that show up for it. So the marshals are excuse me, are our old federal police group. That's what they are. They really are. They've been around and they continue to be around. They are very useful and very prevalent. So it's not like it's some podunk little thing that's still around. No, it's actually like they have some of the highest numbers too, because they have to have numbers in every judicial district. All right, now we're getting into, like I said, the USCIS and ICE. So I just want to real quickly say the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, was developed in 2003. 2003? Yeah. DHS was developed in 2003 and absorbed several different departments and different agencies into itself. So DHS absorbed the United States immigration group. So they did grab. Sorry, my brain just did a brain fart. The Department of Homeland Security grabbed in the customs and immigration units. They also gathered the TSA, and they also absorbed not Homeland Security. They are Homeland Security. They absorbed Secret Service. The Department of Homeland Security is its own department that exists nowadays, and even obviously at time of writing the textbook and things like that, this is something that has existed. But it's not something that's always existed, and that's why it's important to talk about this from a historical perspective. The Department of Homeland Security is a new branch of government, and it's an agency that oversees multiple different sub-agencies. Just because Homeland Security is one department doesn't mean that everything underneath it is the same department. They are all part of this larger group now. So the United States Customs and Immigration Services, so they are the lawful immigration to the United States. That's their focus. Their job is to provide accurate and helpful information and services. They evaluate and grant immigration and citizenship. Citizenship, it wasn't customs. It's citizenship and immigration services. Sorry. But they evaluate and grant immigration and citizenship benefits. They promote awareness of citizenship, and they ensure integrity and fairness of the immigration system. Please hear me as I say this. USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. Their job, they are the social workers. They are the ones that are helping people through the process to legally become United States citizens. They're the ones that help immigrants become nationalized U.S. citizens. They're the people that help whenever we have anyone coming to this country who is trying to become a legal U.S. citizen. That's the USCIS. ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And by the way, all this information also comes from the actual individual websites, .govs, that you can look this up as well. ICE, their job is to protect America from cross-border crime and illegal immigration that threatens national security and public safety. This is directly from their website. ICE's goal is to protect America from cross-border crime and illegal immigration that threatens national security and public safety. That is their job. And so it's important to note that ICE, this is the law enforcement component of DHS. This is the law enforcement part that has to do with immigration. If USCIS is all about the social work side of helping people through the immigration process, ICE is the law enforcement side. And specifically, they're within the United States. Because we also need to talk about CBP, Customs and Border Protection. So Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, is responsible for protecting the U.S. from the cross-border crime and illegal immigration that threatens national security and public safety. Cross-border crime. Customs and Border Protection are charged with keeping terrorists and their weapons out of the U.S. while facilitating lawful international travel and trade. Hopefully you are seeing the difference here. If not, let me make it clear. Immigration and Customs Enforcement is after people have entered the country. Their responsibility is to protect the U.S. from cross-border crime and illegal immigration that threatens national security and public safety. They're the ones that are trying to stop these types of crimes that threaten national security. Customs and Border Protection, these are the people who are actually on the border. ICE is within the United States. Customs and Border Protection is on the border. Again, this is from directly their website. These individuals are charged with keeping terrorists and their weapons out of the U.S., while at the same time making sure that there's lawful international travel and trade. They're the ones that make sure that legally you are you when you enter the country. They're making sure that no one who's not supposed to be here comes in here. They're making sure that you don't bring anything illegal that you're not supposed to bring or that you're not allowed to bring into the country. They're facilitating lawful international travel and trade. CBP is at the borders. Their job is to make sure that everyone coming in is following the rules. ICE deals with people as they've come in and are breaking the law and they aren't there legally. So there is a difference between ICE and Border Patrol, okay? Want to emphasize that. So I will tell you, I put Secret Service and Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, together because, as well, they are two parts of the Department of Homeland Security now. But as well, both of them are fairly focused and they don't need a whole slide to talk about them like some of the other ones have. So the Secret Service began with a focus on crimes related to the Treasury, aka our financial security, the money of the United States, the gold of the United States. The Secret Service protects the nation's financial infrastructure. This is still true. Yes, it is true. Secret Service provides protection services, and this includes things for, yes, president, vice president, for any family members of those individuals as in visiting and whatnot, as well as foreign dignitaries. Any type of foreign person, any important foreign person who comes from another country and needs protection, typically Secret Service is the security, and I put that in air quotes. They're the ones that provide that kind of protection. So, yes, is Secret Service known publicly for being, oh yeah, I protect the president and vice president? Yes, that's true. But it's also important to know that their job is also, they do investigate crimes related to our national treasury, related to big money, things like that. Okay? Please know this. Secret Service is not just a protection group. They also focus on crimes dealing with our nation's financial stability. Counterfeiting US dollars. Yes, it'll definitely be an FBI case, but definitely Secret Service is going to be involved as well. TSA, Transportation Security Administration. Their primary focus is on ensuring safety and security of travelers and the transportation systems involved in interstate commerce. If you've traveled anywhere within the United States or outside of the United States, and you've had to go through an airport here in the United States, you're familiar with TSA. You know TSA. TSA itself gets a bad rap, and it definitely is a little bit annoying, and it causes problems for people. And whether you like them or not, their goal and purpose is very clear. They're trying to make sure that everything is safe and secure. And so one of the big things is they have to establish and maintain high standards for transportation security. It's the reason why we stopped letting liquids after a certain amount of limit on flights. It's why you can't bring certain things like weaponry and things like that. Like, they need to have high standards of safety. Again, going back, September 11th was a big wake-up call for security as, how the heck did we let this happen? So there was a big crackdown. We're still dealing with the crackdown. It's lightened up a little bit, but we're still pretty tight on security. But the TSA's job is to figure out what is the proper level of security to make sure that nothing bad happens on a flight, but still allows you to bring what you want. That kind of thing. So they collaborate with various agencies and groups because their focus is on travel. Their focus is on interstate commerce and travel. So like between states, between countries, things like that, which is the international side, not interstate. But the idea is that they need to have proper security in place to make sure that all this stuff works. And how they do this is they use risk-based strategies. And so if you don't know what a risk-based strategy is, it's risk-reward. They have to assess a situation and go, how high of a chance is that person a risk? Do I need to have stop and random screen or search them or things of that nature? So, and this is why I put in parentheses and quotes random screening. So the random screening thing is not truly random as it is. It is based off of this risk-based strategy where there's a general assessment based off of any number of factors to see could you potentially be a security threat to a flight. And so that's what they do. They have to make those calls, and I would not want to be the one to make those calls. Sometimes there are truly random screenings, but other times there are legitimate, quote, random screenings, aka they may be very biased in nature, that kind of thing. You never know. So let's talk about state law enforcement. So you notice, once again, I have two marked with an asterisk. I have state police and highway patrol, both marked with an asterisk. We'll talk about them. But when we talk about state law enforcement, like I said, we're talking about across the entire state. Obviously, these are found in most, if not all, states within the United States. There are some that kind of combine things together. But when we talk about state law enforcement, there is state police, highway patrol, Department of Public Safety, game wardens and wildlife officers, state corrections, transportation, environmental protection agencies, alcohol and beverage control. Like, there are state agencies for all these at different levels. And I just want to emphasize here real quick, there is a difference between state police and highway patrol, and we're going to get into that here in just a moment. So some of these, we're going to talk only about a couple of them. We're going to focus really in depth on a couple of them, but we're going to briefly talk about multiple ones here just in a second. So Department of Public Safety, that should be pretty straightforward and pretty obvious, but these are things that are dealing with within the individual state, any kind of issue that could be a public health problem or a public safety issue. We're talking, security, and I don't mean like general security, but like big group security. We're talking drugs and alcohol. We're talking these, alcohol and beverage control is ABC. But public safety's focus is on the health and well-being of the general population of the state. And so, like I said, alcohol and beverage control, they technically are also part of public safety. A lot of places they tend to work together, but alcohol and beverage control is making sure that, standards are being met for the not only the consumption, but the brewing of alcoholic beverages and things of that nature. They're making sure that things are being followed properly. So, got to talk about EPA real quick. Environmental Protection Agencies. Yes, there is a national EPA, but there's also several state EPAs. States also have their own usual FBIs, their SBIs, State Bureau of Investigation. This is just one of those. I wanted to use the Environmental Protection Agency as an example of there are state-level federal groups. And so for state environmental protection agencies, they're focused primarily on the general environmental well-being of that particular state. So it's important to note that Pennsylvania has a very different environmental requirement and geography than Colorado. So Colorado's EPA might not have the best advice or rules in mind for Pennsylvania, and vice versa. So that's why there are state EPAs that look at the emissions regulations, well-being, and keeping up of biological life, plant life, whatever it might be, within the individual state. And which is where I was using that to also kind of bring in game wardens and wildlife officers. So I'm assuming because you are here that you are a Pennsylvania resident, and you've probably been a Pennsylvania resident for a long time, most of your life, hopefully, or a good portion of your life. Anyway, here in the state of Pennsylvania, there is deer hunting season. The beginning of deer season is essentially a non-official state holiday. It's a big day. So legitimately here in Pennsylvania, and especially in Erie County, our EPA and wildlife officers and wardens, like, this is a big thing. So especially in Erie, like I said, we have fishing. So fish and wildlife are things that are under game wardens and wildlife officers. So you have to have a license to fish here in Pennsylvania, but also in Erie. They have a no license day to fish, so you can get your feet wet metaphorically and be like, all right, yeah, I like this, and then you could apply and get a license, but you need a license for hunting, things of that nature. These are the people that enforce that. These are individuals who are making sure that rules are being followed, that you are not wiping out an entire population, that you are doing the proper hunting with the proper tools and the proper setting, that you are not wiping out an entire population, that you are keeping the ecosystem in check. This is where I say I am not against hunting. I support it because it is a conservation thing. If you're a person who's like, hunting is terrible, it serves a purpose, believe it or not, if you're one of those people that really struggles with it. But it's a state law enforcement gig that is important, especially here in Pennsylvania. It's important in a lot of areas that have different ecological systems and unique wildlife. Another example that I like to pull up, and it's a crazy one, but Florida. Florida has wildlife officers. Florida has the Everglades, which is a national forest. It's a national park. You don't really want to visit it publicly, but it's a nationally preserved land that has its own regulations for animals. And because of several invasive species of snakes, lizards, and other things that have gotten into the Everglades, there are specific hunting permits and things that are allowed, specifically like to hunt pythons, because there's a whole bunch of invasive pythons in the Everglades in Florida. So like technically those are okay to hunt, but a normal other snake is not. It's a whole complicated matter. But what I'm trying to say is when it comes to law enforcement and game wardens and EPA, it's not just, you can't dump waste here. It's also the hunting component. It's also the what animals belong here, what don't, what populations are in flux, which ones are overabundant, which ones are underabundant, things of that nature. I know this is definitely not the conversation you thought you were going to be having in this class or at this point, but it's important to talk about because it is a component of state law enforcement, and especially in this area, in this region, hunting is a big thing. It's a very popular thing, and a lot of people are really passionate about. And if you're passionate about hunting and you're in criminal justice and you're looking for a potential career, might I suggest game warden or wildlife officer, fish and wildlife officer for the state of Pennsylvania. It doesn't mean you don't get to hunt anymore. You still get to hunt, but now you also get to enforce the rules. So it's something worth thinking about. All right. So now I want to get into some of the specific nitty-gritty ones that I want to talk about. So like highway patrol. This is important. Highway patrol is focused with traffic control and traffic enforcement, typically on state and federal highways. Hear me as I say this. Highway patrol is focused on traffic control and traffic enforcement, typically on state and federal highways. State police patrol, respond to calls, investigate crimes, maintain criminal records, operate crime labs, train local officers. Wait a second. Aren't state police and highway patrol the same thing? No. State police and highway patrol are not the same thing. Highway patrol, yes, tends to be staffed by state police or has a direct connection to the state police office. But highway patrol alone is not the same as state police. Okay? It's a particular branch of state police. Highway patrol, their primary focus is on traffic control and enforcement on highways. Period. State police do way more than just participate in highway patrol. So, state police as a unit, as a department, their job is to manage statewide law enforcement information systems. This is why when you do fingerprints for the state of Pennsylvania, they go to the state police. The state police have a record of everyone's fingerprints for any type of fingerprinting done here in Pennsylvania. They have the full database. They take care of the full database. They're also the ones who are in charge of the full databases for sexual predators. They're the ones that are in charge of any type of criminal database that is used. In the state of Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania State Police have those information systems. They're the ones that manage and maintain those archives. Okay? So state police already, we have something that makes them different than highway patrol. I'm hoping that you understand that state police is a complicated, complex job that has multiple areas. So they not only manage the enforcement information systems, they also tend to, in most places, are involved with the training of police officers and are directly involved with the police academies. Here in Pennsylvania, they have some, but not all. There are some, you could call them private police academies. They're not private police academies, but they are police academies that have been approved by the state police but are not run by the state police. So here in Erie, technically in Northeast, there is a police academy that's run through Mercyhurst University. It's out Northeast. That one is a state-recognized police academy for local police, but it is not run by the state police. Okay? State police also assist local agencies. This can be helping with large cases, or in other cases, if a local jurisdiction does not have a police department, either another nearby police department will be part of their jurisdiction, or if there's not one nearby, state police act as the local police for that area. So they assist local agencies or replace a local agency for tiny rural areas where there's not a law enforcement agency. They also are typically, especially in smaller jurisdictions, they act as the special weapons and tactics teams. So obviously SWAT is special weapons and tactics. What I want to say here, and this is important, depending on the size of the local jurisdiction, the local police department, the size of the city, the budget, things like that, they might have a local SWAT team. But in cases where that is not possible, state police act as the SWAT team for those smaller jurisdictions. In a post-September 11th world, they also offer homeland security at the state level, so they work on counterterrorism and intelligence cases as well. They are a big component of ensuring accountability in police misconduct. So while, yes, there is Office of Internal Affairs, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, state police, they are part of the accountability group for local municipality police misconduct. And the other thing that state police are a big component of, and should be a big component of, is public education and outreach. It's not just local police officers that need to be part of the community. It's also state police. So that's just one of those things to keep in mind. So state corrections. Before we dive into this, we have an intro to corrections course. If you're interested more in corrections, take that course. I mean, it's a requirement for the degree anyway, but we'll talk way more about corrections in that specific course, but briefly to talk about it. So state corrections are individuals who work with incarcerated individuals, people who have gone through the courts already. They've been convicted of a crime and they are sentenced. So you are working with convicted individuals. There's a whole bunch of psychology around it. There are local, state, and federal corrections. I want to emphasize, even though I put it at state level, there are local corrections as well as federal correction agencies. But one thing I do want to say here specifically is that here in Pennsylvania, our local Erie corrections and our state PA corrections are always looking for new hires. They're currently in a hiring slump. There's not a whole lot of applicants right now. So they are actively looking for people. So if you're interested in corrections, be sure to, go to one of the local or state correction agency websites and fill out an application. You never know. You could get a job and still be able to finish your degree and get paid while you're doing it in a job like this. But one thing that I do want to talk about that we talk, like I said, more in depth in Intro to Corrections, but corrections are like a mini society. There are several roles that need to be filled within corrections. From the policing standpoint, we have guards and things of that nature who, ensure the safety and security of the individuals involved in the correctional facility. But in corrections, there is maintenance, there's food service, there is IT, there is so many other jobs. So this is why I say if you're interested in corrections as a potential career, whether it's through criminal justice or through a different type of thing, here in PA we're looking, so it's worth putting an application in. Anyway, so when we talk about local law enforcement, there's two major breakdowns. Hear me as I say this again. At local level of law enforcement, there are two major breakdowns. There's the Office of the Sheriff, and there are local police departments. That's local law enforcement. There's local police departments, and there's the Office of the Sheriff. And so those are the two primary breakdowns. The Office of a Sheriff is either elected or appointed. I want to emphasize this. It's elected or appointed. So in some states, sheriffs are appointed by the acting governor, mayor, whatever. Well, it's usually governor. But they put a person in place and say that person is in charge of leading the sheriff's office. Here in PA, we elect our sheriff. And so if you have to remember, both earlier this year and technically a couple years ago, there were elections for county sheriff. Like, that's a legitimate office that we in PA elect. Some others don't. They're just appointed. But it's important to note that this is a state decision, so depending on where you're looking, might have different rules for how someone gets put into the job of sheriff. But the sheriff's primary purpose, their main job, is to run jails, which, reminder for anyone from other criminal justice courses, there's a difference between a jail and a prison. A jail is a temporary sentence of usually a year or less. Obviously, there's some extenuating circumstances that make it last longer, and it's also for non-serious crimes. Prisons are longer-term investments with less mobility and tend to be more serious crimes. The Sheriff's Department is also in charge of serving court documents, ensuring court security. So technically the bailiff is from the Office of the Sheriff, not from the local police departments. And this is where the other weird little thing comes in. If there is a sheriff in the area and there is not a local PD, the sheriff's department is to cover the local jurisdiction that has no PD. Now, if there's an area that doesn't have a sheriff and doesn't have a PD, yes, state police step in and they act as the police department there. That's why I'm like emphasizing there are different levels to this, and it was easier to talk about it in places rather than all at once. And then we get to our most obvious and most understood, and typically students who are interested in policing already want to do this. This is their already focus. And that is local police departments. And so obviously the size of the department is related to the size of the community and the funding. Please note, the size of the community and the amount of funding that a police department gathers will determine the size of the department. It'll also determine whether or not there are specialized units and all these other things. Police departments can be primary law enforcement, the regular officers, the patrol officers that you see, and or it could be just specialized units. So here in Erie, we also have the scuba unit because we have the lake and we have a decent amount of crime that happens with that. So we do have a scuba particular specialized unit. Just going to throw that out there, just because it's always fun. But like I said, with the size of the community, the funding, budget, and financing has a direct impact on police departments. So financing can come from multiple different areas for local police. It can come from state, like actual grants and things that are dedicated aside for particular police departments. It can come from within the community. It could be community-based and be funded by a particular organization, which then gets a little messy and confusing. It can be part of the local budget. It can be part of the state budget. There are so many possible locations for financing that it becomes a complicated matter. So budgeting is a key component of the police department as a whole. We'll talk about it more when we talk about some specific jobs of police departments, which is what we're going to be diving into pretty much next. But policing as a whole, and please note, as a whole, needs comprehensive training. This comes back to budgeting and finance and the size of the department and all these other things. Comprehensive training, there's enough data out there to show us that comprehensive police training that is well established and is teaching all the proper methods and individual pieces and understanding the nuance and complexity of it. Comprehensive training is the best training there is. It gets complicated when not every department has the financing or the budget to do comprehensive training. So, within a police department, there are multiple different roles. And so, there are two big areas that I want to talk about, and then we're going to talk about another one. There's three areas that I really want to focus on within police departments, and we'll talk about them. But so there's line operation, which is the front line policing. These are the things that when you talk about policing and you ask someone, what's a police department? These are the things they think of. They're the patrol people. They're the traffic enforcement, criminal investigation, crime prevention, community service. Police department, you ask someone, what's a police department do? They're telling you the line operation things. These are the things that people see up front and personal. These are the things that people immediately associate with policing. But, and this is important, there is auxiliary services. There are things that are behind the scenes. And when I say behind the scenes, I don't mean like, oh, they're hidden, nobody can see. No, it's just usually the public doesn't tend to see these things. Within the police department, there's records maintenance. They keep track of all those records, as well as property and evidence management. Like, they have to keep proper listing, cataloging of everything they have, whether that be a person's case file or it's evidence in a case or property that was obtained during a search or anything like that. They have to maintain all these things. These are things that you don't think about when you initially think about policing, but these are things that I'm trying to emphasize to you. Policing is a multifaceted job. It's not just patrol. It's not just solving a crime. There's other components to this too. Forensic laboratory services. You need to, there are different groups. Detention, which is holding of an individual. This is where jails come in. Alcohol testing, facilities and equipment maintenance, coordination of volunteers. People volunteer for the police department. And I don't just mean like required for, prison release and community service, but like actual other volunteers. Like these are all components of a police department that, again, if you asked an everyday person, what's a police department do? They're not thinking about those things. Those are the things that are behind the scenes. This is the other one that I really want to talk about with policing, and that's administration. So, quick fun fact for you, my criminal justice degree in particular is in criminal justice administration. So, yes, I took a whole bunch of criminal justice courses, but also part of that was administration. And so I want to talk a little bit about policing administration, and this goes for all levels, not just the local level. But I wanted to put it here because this is an important aspect that when people tend to think about policing and think about careers in criminal justice, you don't tend to think about administration when you first go in. You think about it years down the road. And so this is just a chance for you to start thinking about this stuff a little bit beforehand if you're interested. So administration, its primary purpose is to support the staff. First and foremost, a good administration will support their staff. And I don't mean, oh, you can get away with whatever you want. No, I mean they provide support so that your staff can do whatever it is that they need to do. A good administration also acts as guidance and leadership. Okay? Good administration acts as the guide for good leadership. They're showing you what you need to do, how you should be working, how you should be operating. Within the realm of policing and criminal justice, good administrators understand the unique balance between working with the everyday people and community at large, having that discretion, as well as understanding that there are ways and procedures that need to be followed. Administration needs to be able to support their staff, but also needs to enforce the rules. Okay? So, administration has some big roles that they have to do. Obviously, they're in charge of hiring and training. Administration is in charge of hiring and training. They need to make sure that the training that they're doing is of decent enough caliber, a high caliber, that they're going to get a good officer out of it, but they also need to make sure that they are hiring the best candidates. And I know in general for a fact that right now policing is a severely under applied job right now. Policing is not in the top popular jobs at this time. Not that they're not hiring. They're hiring, but people aren't taking the jobs. And so it is important that administration is hiring both to meet the minimum requirements of people that they need on staff, but also to make sure that they're properly vetted and good candidates. So it's not easy for administration, especially in a almost like a drought of applicants. Another key role of administration, which comes back to what we were talking about before, is budgeting. Administration's job is to make sure that the funding that is received is going to where it needs to go. They have to figure out how much goes to an individual's payment, how much goes towards this particular improvement that is needed, how many new cars do we need, how many replacements do we need. Budgeting is a complicated thing, and if you've never done actual budgeting, it's not easy. It may seem easy the first couple times you do it, but the more pieces that you add to budgeting, the more complicated it gets. Take business marketing and accounting and things like that. You'll understand that budgeting gets very nightmare. And especially when you consider in policing and in criminal justice, certain things tend to be more expensive than others. changes that budgeting number completely. And then another role of administration is internal affairs. They need to work with internal affairs as well as essentially act as a police for their officers. Like I said, a good administration supports their staff and acts as the guidance. That's good leadership, is providing the proper guidance. So this means, yeah, they need to hold their officers accountable, which also makes it complicated because how do you build trust and rapport with your officers if you are also turning them in when they do things wrong? Well, should be pretty obvious. Don't do something wrong. It gets complicated. So, other things that make administration a generally complicated process and why not everybody likes to go into administration, but it's important to note, is that you need to understand policy and building accountability. It's just in general. You need to understand how policy works and make sure that accountability is being not only maintained, but established. There's the importance of standards and accreditation. You can't just say, yeah, do whatever you want. You need to have standards. But the other thing with administration that brings all this stuff to a head is navigating the landscape of public information and safety. Administration, their job is to talk and provide those general statements to the public. The police are working on this case. Safety is good here in this area. They need to understand what information does the public need to know, but also to provide safety to the officers investigating and things of that nature. This is not an easy job. And I will say, historically speaking, as far as criminal justice, there was not a good model for transitioning to administration. It was not something that was ever really encouraged for a long time in the history of policing. Now, more modernly, yes, we do actually, have mentorships, and there is actual continuing education and things like that nature to help people go into administration for policing. But go back 60 years, it really wasn't like that. It was just kind of I want to be in charge. And then they got there and it was a whole lot of learning on the job, and a lot of things happened. So we have a better system now, but we're developing. And that should be said. That's not just true in criminal justice, it's in other fields as well. But I want to put out there to you, administration is not an easy job, whether it's criminal justice or otherwise. It is a balancing act between dealing with everyone else outside of your command and all the people that are directly under your command. It's a complicated game. Anyway, this is our last thing that we're going to talk about today, and that's the specialized units. So we talked a little bit about SWAT already, but I just wanted to emphasize here that these specialized units, not every local department is going to have a specialized unit. As I said, it's going to depend on their size. But in general, I wanted to talk briefly about some of these specialized units, just to give you a general outline and understanding. There is a Word document on Blackboard as well. It is my short notes page on these individual specialized units. So by all means, I made that available so that if I pull information from these particular notes, you have them as well. So SWAT, want to give you a little bit of history on special weapons and tactics, because most of us that are taking this class and whatnot have been around, and SWAT has always been a thing, but historically it's not always been a thing, and I want to talk about that. So in the late 1960s, there were a lot of dangerous situations that were happening, hostage crises, and back then they just sent every officer. They didn't have a specialized SWAT team. They didn't have necessarily a hostage negotiator. They just sent every officer to try to help the situation. And that clearly doesn't work. You need specialized teams who are trained and know how to do specific operations of that nature. And so one of the big ones that comes up, I'm going to tell you right now, this is not going to be a test question, But if you're looking for a nice extra credit bonus thing, 1966, the University of Texas Tower shooting is classified as a mass murder. We had Charles Joseph Whitman. He was an ex-Marine, 22, 23 years old, right around that age. And he was a student at the University of Texas, and he shot and killed 15 people and injured 21 others in the span of 96 minutes. That's an hour and a half. That's a typical action movie. In an hour and a half, one man killed 15 people and injured 21 others. That's a lot. It may not seem like it, but that's a lot for that time. He also did it with a sniper rifle, and he did it while held up in the tower, which is why it's called the University of Texas Tower shooting. But because of situations like this, where we had Vietnam veterans and war veterans coming back, and we also had lots of homegrown terrorism, Timothy McVeigh, whatnot. Like, you can go through the history of it. We had a lot of dangerous situations in the United States. But these incidents led to the need for specialized teams to develop and to be the ones that are there to respond to these situations. So SWAT itself is the special forces of policing. They receive special training. They have specialized equipment. It's super specific equipment too, riot gear, things of that nature. Their job is to protect important people, manage large protests, conduct surveillance, help serve search and arrest warrants in dangerous situations. SWAT is the special forces of policing. I want to emphasize, though, and I put this in the notes as well, the SWAT team itself is viewed as controversial, especially in drug law enforcement, because they act too much like the military. It's not to say that drug enforcement is inherently like safer or extra dangerous or anything of that nature, but the handling of those situations tends to be a little more militaristic, and there are some issues because not all drug traffickers are using weaponry, and so there's some intense moments and things of that nature, as well as dealing with large crowds, where they're supposed to be managing large protests. I urge you to look back to the summer of 2020 when we had the entirety of the Black Lives Matter George Floyd protests, and lots of local SWATs were released, and there's lots of footage of officers being excessive. Like, this is not something that's unusual, but that's why SWAT team is viewed as highly controversial by a lot of general public, because they're known to go a little bit above and beyond. As far as prostitution, so depending on where you are, prostitution is technically only legal in very select areas of Nevada, but prostitution is inherently a gray area because people view it differently. Truly. Often prostitution goes hand in hand with drugs like methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin, especially with the illegal prostitution and illegal drug trade. So they're closely connected a lot of times, and so there's a lot of crossover enforcement and whatnot. But what I want to talk about with prostitution in general is this is one of those crimes that is based off of sensibilities. One of the classic jokes of prostitution is it's the oldest profession. It's been around since the dawn of time. If you're a somewhat religious person, prostitution's been around since before Jesus was around, and it's true. Like, truly, prostitution is one of the oldest jobs that exists out there, and it's important to note there's a lot of science and a lot of data on it. Not all prostitution is human trafficking. There is a serious problem with human trafficking in the prostitution career in the field of prostitution, but not everybody who becomes a prostitute does so because of human trafficking. Not everybody becomes a prostitute because of drug problems. This is emerging data. This is newer data that we've not had a super long time for. So I want to emphasize that because of this, I don't see prostitution changing legally anytime relatively soon. But it's worth noting that this is something that keep an eye on. The laws are going to get weird and change at different times about prostitution, simply because, again, if we're talking about human trafficking, yeah, there's entire departments and units and whatnot that are designed to prevent this and go against this. But there's also everyday people who go into sex work, and they do it because they want to, because it's a whether it's an easier outlet for earning money or it's something that they want to do. This is a complicated area, and as a criminal justice professor, it's difficult for me to talk about the legal stance of prostitution because it's in flux and we don't know. But I want to emphasize that because there's often a connection to domestic violence, there's a connection to drugs, there's a connection to human trafficking, they tend to have maybe not a direct prostitution unit, but prostitution is part of another unit and that kind of thing. So domestic violence, this one's extra complicated, and I apologize to anyone who has ever suffered from domestic violence. I don't mean to trigger you. This is a component of the job. This is a component of policing, so we do need to talk about it. But domestic disputes are one of the more common reasons for an individual to call the police, and I don't mean an individual involved in the domestic disturbance or dispute. So it's one of those neighbors hear yelling, shouting, breaking glass, things like that, and they call the police, and police go to investigate a domestic disturbance, potentially a domestic violence situation. So I want to emphasize that. It's not the people involved, it's usually neighbors and whatnot. Not all calls involve violence. Domestic dispute calls, not all of them involve violence, but it is a significant issue. About 20% of all non-fatal violent crimes against women are from domestic violence, and about 3% of all non-fatal violent crimes against men. Okay? So domestic violence is not something that is only done to women. It is done to men as well. The data, though, supports that it happens predominantly more often to women than to men. But what's really important with understanding domestic violence and domestic disputes is it's a very complicated crime. And this is something that officers need very specific, specialized training in. And it's why there usually is a specified officer or a particular group of officers that deal with domestic violence. Because one of the key things with understanding this is understanding the complicated psychology of domestic abuse and domestic violence. So there are several different things that are talked about within the text itself. But one of the things I want to talk about is the cycle of violence. The complicated cycle of abuse and the way a victim continues to go back or refuses to leave their abuser. This is something that, in general, a general population who has no understanding of this or no experience tends to go, why did that person stay with them? There is complicated, numerous psychological reasons. Things as commonplace and understood as Stockholm Syndrome, where you feel a personal bond to your captive or abuser. But the cycle of abuse, when an officer comes and they see, the same victim with the same person, and they're hurt over and over again, it's hard for them to see it as a real problem and not just a relationship issue, not a criminal issue. And so that's why understanding the cycle of violence. The cycle of violence is in 3 parts. There's tension building, acute battering, and a honeymoon phase. So the cycle of violence follows this three-part cycle. There's tension building where things aren't quite great. You're building up this kind of, not anxiety, but anger, aggression, whatever it might be. There is this tension that is palpable. And then it finally recognizes itself and it comes out in acute assault, acute battery, where there is some kind of physical harm. And there's a lash out. It's some kind of physical reaction. But then after the event has happened, there's a honeymoon phase where things seem to be getting better and the person isn't hurting them. And this psychology, what this does, this cycle of abuse causes an individual to feel like, oh, that was just a one-time thing. The honeymoon phase lulls the person back into a sense of false security. And so they stay. And then the cycle begins again. Like, this is why domestic violence is a very complicated crime. Because of this cycle of violence, because of the numerous possibilities of psychological reasons that an abuser, an abusee a victim will stay with an abuser, is super complicated, and there's not a one size fits all. I want to emphasize that now. I know I'm talking about like the cycle of abuse or cycle of violence is a big one. One size does not fit all with these cases. So, comprehensive education and training for officers is key for domestic violence. But the other thing that we have some data on is that comprehensive approach to dealing with domestic violence tends to be the best way to help prevent these crimes. And this means being involved throughout the process. It's trying to prevent the violence from happening in the first place. So usually arriving to a call before physical violence has occurred and trying to stop it from happening. So you might intervene at the tension building rather than the acute battering phase. This means also stopping immediate violence. So if you're there as it's happening, you are preventing the immediate danger and you are securing the situation, as well as preventing further victimization, whether this is incarcerating an individual, whether this is pressing charges, whether this is providing services, putting someone in touch with someone else, or whatever that might be. Comprehensive approach, a comprehensive guide to dealing with domestic violence is a key component to helping bring this number down. And like I said, it's an overly complicated situation itself. I don't want to belittle that and make it seem like, oh, there's a simple solution. There is not a simple solution to domestic violence. As much as we want it to be, there is not a simple solution. Okay? So domestic violence is difficult and complicated for policing in general, hence why they now have specialized units designed and trained for them in particular. There was a time where there was no specialized domestic violence or domestic abuse office or officer. It was just any old officer. And because of the cycle of abuse and the way people see the same person go back with the same person, they go, there's nothing I can do. We understand more of the psychology now. Now we dive into it a little bit more. I'm not going to talk much about drugs simply because, narcotics as a department or drugs their focus is on drug use and trafficking. The goal is to stop the source of the drug problem in the jurisdiction. It's pretty straightforward. As far as a specialized unit, I really don't need to talk about it. Drug units, narcotics units are focused on the illegal trafficking of drugs, period. I can't be any more obvious than that. So as far as juveniles is concerned, juvenile justice is complicated and different. We teach, and I wrote this even, we teach a whole class on juvenile justice that goes more in depth on this. So if you want to know more, and you have to take it anyway, take juvenile justice. Important thing to note, and this is important for juvenile justice and important for specialized unit, juveniles are still growing, maturing, and learning. The science says that they need help, not just punishment. The system itself now typically has specific juvenile officers who work with juvenile offenders. Again, much like domestic violence, in the past, we didn't always have juvenile officers. We had just a regular officer talking to a juvenile. That's a strategy. But as we've learned, having someone who has a caring presence, can be firm, but fair and understands the unique nature of a juvenile, that makes a difference. We've learned that the psychology of a juvenile delinquent, typically they need some kind of proper guidance. They don't just need to be punished, they need raising, they need guidance. So now we have specialized juvenile officers who are trained and learn more about the psychology of adolescents and learning as they develop. And so now we also understand, we need to have these people who are working with the juveniles, not just, Bob, the old officer who's been there for 40 plus years, who's never worked with a juvenile, who yells at the child for skipping school. It didn't really solve the problem. You're just yelling at them. That kind of thing. So, Internal Affairs investigates complaints against police department employees, covering a wide range of complaints. These complaints include excessive force, sexual harassment, hostile work environment, unfair treatment, retaliation, inappropriate sexual comments or behavior, or inappropriate comments about someone's person or identity, race, gender, sexual orientation, any religion, whatever it might be. IA, we talked about a little bit when we talked about administration. Internal Affairs, their focus is to hold the police accountable. Their job is not to stop the police from doing their job. Their goal is to make sure the police are doing their job and doing it correctly. Okay? There's a big Hollywood myth that Internal Affairs is just out to stop police and they're terrible. That's Copaganda 101. It's the whole we don't need oversight, we're the police itself. Yeah, that's not really what it's like. Internal Affairs is not there to cause problems. Internal Affairs is there to make sure that everything is being done properly and correctly. And then cybercrime. As I already said before, cybercrime is the new and emerging field in policing, and I put air quotes around new and emerging. I also put the quotes around in the text that I provide to you. Obviously, cybercrime is new to the realm of policing. To most of you probably grew up with technology, so you're like, cybercrime, this is nothing. Yeah. The general issue now with cybercrime is that where's the crime scene? Where's the victim? Where's the culprit? Cybercrime is complicated because cyberspace. It could be happening anywhere geographically. Now when you're dealing with a crime, the crime scene itself could be a non-physical location. It happened on the internet. There's not really a real crime scene you can investigate. You can investigate the website, and that's your crime scene. Who's the victim? The victim is someone in my normal jurisdiction. Awesome. Who's the culprit? Oh, they're halfway across the world. This makes it complicated. How do you deal with that kind of problem? So understanding how technology works is important. Understanding how the internet works, understanding how the different tools, programs, whatnot work, that's a key component of cybercrime. But also, just as important is collaboration with many different jurisdictions globally to ensure that the criminal activity is stopped. I want to emphasize, because cybercrime can happen anywhere, this means that there are local jurisdictions and local police that reach out to their local state investigative unit. They might be reaching out to their local branch of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They're working with international groups trying to find crimes and solve the crimes. Cybercrime is a unique and developing area. And I want to emphasize, even because when I was taking my classes, cybercrime was still a very new thing in criminal justice. This is an evolving field. There is some interesting research on it. There is some new systems for developing and dealing with cybercrime, but it's one of those fields that as we get further along and as younger officers come in who grew up with technology, this is going to become a more established and more well understood and documented area. But I want to emphasize that cybercrime is a specialized unit and something that we need to be aware of. All right, that's it. That was our careers in criminal justice as in policing, but as criminal justice as a whole. Thank you very much. Like I said, I know this was definitely shorter than the last two, but hopefully you needed that little bit of break. You have a quiz this week, and other than that, that's it. Hang in there, and I will see you in the next video.